We're looking at a single peculiar image, a young man walking through a forest on the way to his own wedding, stops. He is rehearsing his vows. For practice, he takes the wedding ring and places it on what looks like a gnarled twig sticking up from the ground. He recites the sacred words, and then the ground trembles. The twig writhes. It is not a twig, it is the bone of a finger attached to a hand, attached to an arm. A corpse, wearing the tattered remains of a wedding dress, rises from the shallow earth and speaks. With your vow, she says, you have made me your wife. This moment is the seed of a story many of us know, a story that became a beloved stop-motion film filled with whimsical skeletons and gothic charm. But what we are seeing here in its original form is not charming. It is unsettling. It is raw. The journey from that dark forest to the polished, beautiful melancholy of Tim Burton's Corpse Bride is a long one, and it is a journey of erasure. The film presents us with a gentle, tragic ghost named Emily, caught between worlds by a wicked lord. It is a love triangle, a story of personal choice and finding one's place. It's a beautiful fantasy, but the story it came from is not a fantasy. It is a piece of Jewish folklore, a tale that was passed down through generations in Eastern Europe. And if we look closely, if we trace its path backward, we find that the story is not about a love triangle. It is not about whimsy. It is a coded testament to an almost unimaginable horror. The question we must ask is not just what the original story was, but why it needed to be told. What kind of historical wound was so deep that it could only be spoken of through the voice of a ghost bride rising from the earth? This is not a simple ghost story. This is evidence. Our investigation begins not with the film, but with the text it was born from. The tale is often called The Finger, and its most widely cited version comes to us through the work of folklorist Howard Schwartz, who collected it from oral traditions. The story's roots are ancient, with some scholars tracing its basic structure to the 16th century mystic Rabbi Isaac Luria of Safed. But its heart, its soul, was forged in the shtetls, the Jewish towns of Russia and Poland. This geographical and cultural anchor is our first critical clue. The story belongs to a specific people in a specific and very dangerous place. It is their memory we are about to excavate. Let's look at what that memory contains. The folk tale is deceptively simple in its structure, but every detail is significant. We have a young man, often named Reuven or something similar, from a good family. He is traveling to another village to marry a young woman he has been promised to. The journey itself is important. He is in a liminal space between his old life and his new one, passing through an unfamiliar landscape. This is a classic folklore trope, the journey through the woods where the rules of the normal world become thin. He is accompanied by friends, and their mood is celebratory, perhaps a little reckless. They are young, on the brink of life's great promises. This is a story about the future. In a moment of youthful bravado, Reuven decides to practice his wedding vows. The storytellers are specific about this. He is not just playing, he is performing the ritual. He finds the object sticking out of the ground, sometimes described as a root, sometimes a twig, but always revealed to be a finger, and he places the wedding ring upon it. He then recites the Hebrew marriage vow, Heri at mekudeshet li betaba'at, zokadat Moshe Yisrael. Behold, you are consecrated to me with this ring according to the law of Moses and Israel. These are not just words. In Jewish law, this declaration, made in the presence of two witnesses, his friends, with an object of value, the ring, constitutes a binding marriage ceremony. He has, legally and spiritually, just married this finger. The immediate consequence is, of course, supernatural. The earth opens, and the corpse, bride emerges. But what happens next is what separates this from a standard campfire tale. The corpse bride does not try to drag him into the underworld, not yet. She does not seek vengeance in the way a typical ghost might. Instead, she makes a legal claim. She follows the young man and his friends to the town where his living bride is waiting. She enters the wedding celebration, a spectre of death amidst the joyous music and dancing, and she asserts her right. "This man is my husband," she declares. The celebration grinds to a halt. The community is thrown into chaos. Notice what the story does here. It transforms a supernatural event into a legal dispute. The problem cannot be solved with an exorcism or a magic sword. It must be solved by the community's established system of justice. The case is brought before the town's rabbi, or sometimes a beit din, a court of 3 rabbinic judges. This is a crucial detail. The world of the living and the world of the dead are presented as being subject to the same divine law. The corpse bride is not just a monster, she is a plaintiff. She has a legitimate case, and she demands a hearing. The story is now unfolding not in a haunted house, but in a courtroom. The rabbis are stumped. The law is the law. A vow was made in the presence of witnesses. A marriage was consecrated. The young man, Reuven, protests that it was a joke, a mistake. But the bride from the grave is adamant. Her life was stolen from her. She was meant to be a bride, to have a husband, to have a life filled with the same joy everyone in this room is celebrating. That was taken from her, and now, through this accidental vow, she has a chance to reclaim a piece of it. Her argument is not just legal, it is emotional. It is a cry against the injustice of her fate. She represents the ultimate interrupted life. The court deliberates. The tension is immense. The entire community holds its breath. On one side is the future, the young man and his living fiancée, representing continuity, family, and the generations to come. On the other side is the past, the dead bride, representing unresolved trauma, memory, and the claims the dead have upon the living. The rabbis consult ancient texts. They argue legal precedents. The story lingers on this process, emphasizing the weight of the decision. How can they honor the law without destroying the future of the young couple? How can they dismiss the claim of the dead without disrespecting her suffering? The resolution, when it comes, is a masterstroke of legal and emotional compromise. The rabbis deliver their verdict. They rule that while a vow was indeed made, the dead have no claim on the living. The intention of the law is to sanctify life, to build families and communities in the world of the living. Therefore, the marriage is annulled. The young man is free to marry his intended bride. It seems like a simple victory for the living, but it is not. Because the story does not end there. As the dead bride hears the verdict, she lets out a final, heartbreaking shriek of despair. Her last hope is gone. She collapses into a pile of bones on the floor. At this moment, the living bride, the woman who has the most to gain from this verdict, is overcome with pity. She weeps for the ghost who was her rival. She understands that this was not a monster, but a woman just like her, whose dreams were turned to dust. Her tears are an act of profound empathy. The community, led by the living bride, then agrees to give the dead bride the funeral she was never given. They collect her bones, perform the proper rites, and bury her with dignity in a consecrated cemetery. They mourn for her as one of their own. It is only after this act of collective mourning, this recognition of her humanity and her tragedy, that the dead bride finds peace. The story concludes with the wedding of the living couple, but it is now imbued with a new solemnity, a deeper understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of memory. They are not just celebrating their own future, they are honouring the past and the lives that were lost. The community has faced its ghost, not by banishing it, but by embracing it. by listening to its story and by giving it the peace it was denied in death. So, we have the story, a cautionary tale about making light of sacred vows, a spooky story about respecting the dead. On the surface, yes. But these interpretations feel thin. They do not account for the story's emotional weight, its legalistic precision, or the specificity of the corpse as a murdered bride. Why a bride? Why is her life so violently interrupted? The story feels less like a fable and more like a scar. To understand the wound beneath it, we have to leave the text and enter the world in which it was told. We have to look at the historical context, not just of its ancient origins, but of its urgent retelling in the 19th and early 20th centuries in the Russian Empire. We are now moving into our second layer of investigation. We are shifting from literary analysis to historical excavation. The world that kept this story alive was the Pale of Settlement, a vast territory in the Western Russian Empire where Jews were legally compelled to live. It was a world of vibrant culture, deep faith, and intellectual life. But it was also a world of crushing poverty, systemic discrimination, and the constant, looming threat of explosive violence. The word for that violence is pogrom. It is a Russian word meaning to wreak havoc, to demolish violently. And from the late 19th century onward, it became synonymous with organised, semi-official massacres of Jewish communities. To understand the story of the Corpse Bride, we need to understand the reality of a pogrom. Historians like Simon Dubnow and John Clear have documented this history in painstaking, harrowing detail. These were not random riots. They were often incited by government officials or clergy, fueled by centuries of anti-Semitic propaganda that painted Jews as Christ killers or revolutionary conspirators. Rumours would spread, a missing Christian child, an economic downturn, and mobs, often fortified with vodka and a sense of righteous fury, would descend upon the Jewish quarter of a town. The violence was intimate and brutal. It was neighbour turning on neighbour. The goal was not just murder, but humiliation. The complete destruction of a community's sense of safety and dignity. Homes were looted, businesses destroyed, synagogues and holy books burned. People were beaten, tortured, and killed in the streets or in their own homes. The local authorities, more often than not, stood by and watched, or even participated. The central government in St. Petersburg would officially condemn the violence while unofficially sanctioning it as a useful way to redirect popular discontent. Now, let's bring this historical reality back to our folktale. Consider the central figure, a murdered bride. Weddings in the shtetl were the absolute pinnacle of communal life. They were moments of immense joy, music, and celebration, affirming the continuity of the community in the face of hardship. A wedding was a public declaration of hope for the future. As such, they were also exceptionally vulnerable targets for mob violence. A pogrom that coincided with a wedding was a particularly cruel act, transforming the ultimate symbol of life into a scene of death. There are historical accounts of wedding parties being attacked, of brides and grooms being murdered on their wedding day. The story's corpse bride is not just any ghost. She is a woman whose life was stolen at the precise moment of its greatest promise. This detail, which seems like a simple Gothic trope, now resonates with a terrible historical frequency. She embodies the thousands of real lives cut short, the futures that were obliterated by mob violence. She is the symbol of the ultimate injustice, to be murdered on the day you were meant to begin your new life. And what about the manner of her burial? The detail of the finger sticking out of the ground. In the sanitized world of the animated film, this is a quirky, spooky image. In the context of a pogrom, it is a statement of horrifying realism. The aftermath of a massacre was chaos. Dozens, Sometimes hundreds of bodies would need to be buried. Proper Jewish burial rituals, which are meticulous and require time and care, were often impossible. Victims were frequently dumped into mass graves, buried hastily in unconsecrated ground to prevent the spread of disease, or simply to clear the streets. A shallow, unmarked grave was a common, tragic fate. The image of a finger protruding from the earth ceases to be a fantasy. It becomes the plausible, gruesome sign of a body not laid to rest with dignity, a grave so shallow that the earth cannot fully contain it. The young man in the story literally stumbles upon the evidence of an atrocity. The ground beneath his feet is not stable, peaceful earth. It is a landscape filled with unremembered dead. The forest he walks through is not a fairy tale setting, it is a graveyard. We are seeing a new pattern emerge. The core elements of the folktale, the murdered bride, the interrupted wedding, the improper burial, are not just narrative devices. They are direct reflections of the lived and died reality for Jews in the Pale of Settlement. The story is beginning to look less like a spooky tale and more like a form of communal testimony. It is a way of talking about the unspeakable. When your history is one of massacre and mass graves, you do not tell your children direct stories about it. It is too traumatic. Instead, you code it. You embed the trauma into a narrative that can be told, that can be passed down, that allows the memory to survive without re-traumatizing each generation. This brings us to a new, more profound question. If the story is a coded trauma narrative, how does that change our understanding of its resolution? What is the function of the rabbinical court? On the surface, it is a clever plot device, but now we can see it as something much deeper. In a world where there was no justice for Jews, where the police would not protect you, the courts would not defend you, and the government encouraged your murder, where could a community turn for a sense of order? They could only turn inward, to their own legal and moral framework. The Beit Din in the story represents a fantasy of justice. It is the creation of an imaginary space where the community's highest ideals, law, reason, compassion, can be brought to bear on an impossible problem. The corpse bride, who represents the real-world victims of the pogroms, can get no hearing in a Russian court. But in the world of the story, she can. Her case is heard, her suffering is acknowledged, and the law is applied. The court is a mechanism for processing trauma. It allows the community to take the chaos and horror of the pogrom and subject it to the logic and order of their own tradition. Let's re-examine the verdict from this perspective. The ruling that the dead have no claim on the living is not a cold, legalistic dismissal. It is a crucial act of psychological survival. A community steeped in trauma cannot afford to be bound to its ghosts forever. It must find a way to honour the past without being consumed by it. The rabbi's decision is a declaration that life must go on. The future cannot be sacrificed to the unending grief of the past. It is a painful but necessary compromise. We must remember the dead, but we must live for the living. And this is why the final act of the story, the mourning, is so critical. The community doesn't just get a legal release from the ghost. They earn it through an act of empathy. The living bride's tears are the key. She sees the corpse bride not as a threat, but as a sister in fate. This act of seeing, of recognizing the humanity of the victim, is what allows for healing. The community then gives the dead bride what the pogrom denied her: a name, a history, and a proper burial. They reclaim her from the anonymity of the mass grave and make her a part of their community again. They are, in a symbolic sense, reburying all the victims of all the pogroms. They are giving them the dignity in story that was denied them in reality. We are now at the bedrock of our investigation. We have peeled back the layers of Gothic romance and simple folklore to uncover a profound and heartbreaking historical artifact. The story of the Corpse Bride is not a story about a ghost who wants a husband. It is the story of a traumatized community figuring out how to survive. It is a narrative ritual designed to do what the real world would not: acknowledge the dead, dispense a form of justice, process grief, and allow the living to continue. The ghost is not a monster, she is an ancestor. Her demand is not for a husband, but for memory. Her story is a portable memorial, a headstone made of words that could be carried by a people who were forced to leave their real graves behind. With this understanding, let us return to where we began, the 2005 film Corpse Bride. What happens when this story, so deeply embedded in a specific historical trauma, is adapted into a piece of mainstream entertainment? The first and most obvious change is the complete removal of its Jewish identity. The setting is a vaguely Victorian, vaguely European town. The vows are generic. The rabbinical court is gone. The entire legal, cultural, and religious framework that gives the original story its meaning has been stripped away. The characters and their motivations are also fundamentally altered. The young man, Victor, is not a brash youth, but a shy, sensitive artist. The corpse bride, Emily, is not an anonymous victim of historical violence, but a specific character with a specific backstory. She was murdered by a con man, Lord Barkis, for her dowry. Her problem is not a communal trauma, but a personal betrayal. The story is no longer about the injustice done to a people. It is about the crime committed against an individual. This change has a profound effect on the story's resolution. In the film, Emily finds peace by getting justice against her personal villain. She stops Lord Barkis from marrying the living bride, Victoria, and after he accidentally drinks poison and dies, she is free. Her personal score is settled. Then, she steps into the moonlight and dissolves into a cloud of butterflies, finding a beautiful, transcendent peace. It is a touching and visually stunning moment. But notice how different it is from the folk tale. Her peace is individual. It comes from vanquishing her foe and releasing her claim on Victor out of the goodness of her own heart. The community of the dead celebrates her release, but the community of the living has almost nothing to do with it. They are mostly comedic, frightened bystanders. There is no collective act of mourning. There is no communal reckoning with the past. The living bride, Victoria, feels some sympathy for Emily, but there is no moment of profound, shared grief that heals the community. The problem is solved, the ghost moves on, and the living are left to their own lives, largely unchanged by the experience. This is not a criticism of the film as a piece of art. It is a beautiful, charming, and moving film on its own terms. But in the process of adaptation, the story's original purpose was completely inverted. A story that was designed to preserve the memory of a collective historical trauma was transformed into a story about resolving a personal, ahistorical one. A narrative about a community learning to live with its ghosts was turned into a narrative about a ghost learning to let go. The intellectual irony is staggering. A story born from the very real horror of anti-Jewish massacres became a whimsical children's film with its cultural and historical DNA so thoroughly scrubbed that almost no trace of its origin remains. The sanitized version is, of course, more palatable. It is easier to sell. A story about a quirky ghost finding peace is universal. A story about the coded memory of pogrom victims is specific, painful, and demands something from the audience. It demands that we look at history, that we confront the reality of violence and trauma. The adaptation chose fantasy over history, individual romance over communal memory, and in doing so, it inadvertently performed one last act of erasure on a story that was created to fight against being erased. So we have journeyed from a beloved animated film back to its source in a dark folk tale, and through that tale into the heart of a painful history. We began with a simple question about a strange story, and found that it was not a story at all, but a vessel for memory, for justice, and for survival. We saw how the tale of a murdered bride raising her finger from the earth was a reflection of the shallow graves and interrupted lives left in the wake of the pogroms that terrorized the Jews of Eastern Europe. We uncovered how the story's strange legalism, its focus on a rabbinical court, was a fantasy of justice for a people who were denied any real justice. It was a community's attempt to impose its own moral order on the chaos of history, and we saw how the story's resolution, not with a wedding for the dead, but with mourning and a proper burial, was a ritual for processing collective trauma, a way to honour the dead so that the living could continue. This investigation reveals a pattern that extends far beyond this single tale. It shows us how folklore functions as a secret archive for oppressed peoples. When you are not allowed to write your own history, when your memorials are destroyed and your cemeteries desecrated, you hide your history in stories. You code your pain into lullabies, your resilience into fables, and your ghosts into cautionary tales. These stories become the only headstones that cannot be toppled. This changes how we must see these narratives. They are not merely quaint artifacts of a bygone era. They are sophisticated psychological tools, forged in the crucible of immense suffering, designed to ensure cultural survival. They are proof that even when a community is shattered, its voice can find a way to speak, even if it is from beyond the grave. When you encounter the story of the corpse bride now, whether in its cinematic form or in a book of old tales, you are no longer looking at a simple Gothic romance or a spooky ghost story. You are seeing the ghost of a ghost story. You are seeing the faint, beautiful, but ultimately hollow echo of a narrative forged in history and fire. You are witnessing the final, spectral trace of a community's desperate and ingenious attempt to remember its murdered daughters and to insist across the generations that their lives and their deaths mattered.